Hello, my name is Matt Gorman. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins University. I'm working under Dr. Ray Nee. Um, and today I'll be presenting our results from PFGT-1, which I'll introduce later, but it's an experimental campaign conducted with NASA Marshall in the summer of 2021. In particular, I'll be looking at our scaling laws that we've identified with this granular cratering problem. So as this audience is well aware, in the plume-surface interaction problem, there's a number of mission risks, but what I'll be talking about in particular today is this cratering problem and how we can predict that crater growth. Next slide, please. So to really study this problem, we first need to understand the fundamental physics at play. And so the need here is for high fidelity experiments. And we have some of those experiments from dating back to the Apollo era. But the goal of this experimental campaign a couple summers ago was to get a wider parameter space of supersonic impinging jets in lunar environments. And so that was really the goal of this campaign. Next slide, please. And so to conduct that test, we had to go to a very large 15-foot vacuum chamber. And this was not only large to house our very large test article, but also because it had to have powerful pumps so that we can maintain lunar pressure conditions or lunar relevant conditions throughout the test as we're injecting air from the impinging jet. Okay, next slide. So this is the test article. So the Johns Hopkins team was in charge of the diagnostics, so we used 3 high-speed cameras to capture both crater evolution and the ejecta dynamics. And in this talk, I'll just be talking about the crater results. Next slide, please. And so here I'm just showing the instrumented regolith bin in the center. And so we're using the same tried and true method by the Philip Metzger and his group with the splitter plate in the middle to expose the crater profile. And on the right, those are just some protective housings around our high-speed cameras to protect them from the extreme environments in the chamber. Next slide, please. What I really want to emphasize is that the advantage of this test series was the parameter space covered. That's really why this data set was so valuable. And in particular, as we changed things like the ambient pressure, the mass flow rate of the jet, the height of the nozzle, we're changing these plume profiles, and that's shown for a lunar case on the left where the plume profile is more expanded versus a Mars relevant pressure case, a little higher pressure on the right, where the plume remains more collimated. But you can see that the ensuing crater growth below is very sensitive to all these variations. Next slide, please. So the first thing we looked at is just what is the crater depth growth versus time. And so the crater depth is just the deepest point of the crater that we measured versus time. And what we found is that there's this very interesting transition across all the many of the cases. And so at early times, there's this linear growth. So this is a log-log plot on the right. And so there's a linear growth at earlier times, but then it transitions to a sublinear growth at later times. And so that's what we really wanted to investigate further with this analysis at Hopkins. So next slide, please. And so what we did is we defined a couple erosion rate parameters. So I'll direct your attention to the left plot first. So we defined this F variable, and this has units of meters per second. So you can think of it as an erosion rate. But if we divide each case by its value of F, that erosion rate, we can find that the depth growth collapses very, very well along a linear growth stage at early times. And then if we take those same data sets at later times, we can find and define a different parameter, this G parameter. It's a different erosion rate. We can find that it collapses, all the cases collapse very well along this 1/3 scaling in time. And so this indicates that that transition is remarkably robust, even though we're changing all these test conditions test to test. The complication here, though, is that if we can't predict F and G, then this scaling transition really, that's kind of where the story dies. And the other problem is that F and G have unknown dependencies to the huge number of parameters that we change test to test. But kind of brute force or naively trudging forward with this analysis, we just plotted this F value versus every parameter that we could think of that we varied through the test. And so what we found is that F is most sensitive to the pressure of the case. So it's really the impingement pressure that seems to be that seems to be what F is most sensitive to. And so next slide. So kind of inspired by that the pressure really here is what is driving this phenomenon. We tried to develop a model that could capture this crater growth. And so we were inspired by this Schmidt-Holtzapfel relationship from impact cratering. And so this relationship relates the size of an impact crater to the energy of the impactor as it collided with the surface. And there's a very nice scaling relationship that's obtained in that analysis. Our situation here is a little different because we don't have energy imparted from a single impact, but we have a continuous energy being injected from the plume. So, but we can still do a similar analysis. So in the next slide, we relate the power of the jet to the change in the kinetic energy of the excavated particles from the jet. So if we just proceed with that analysis and just make a couple small assumptions, one is that the density and the velocity of the particles are constant, then we can directly relate the power of the impinging jet to the volume change rate of the crater. And then so kind of using this model, we went back to our data and made some observations. So at the on the bottom right, we can see at early times, that's the top two figures, and later times is in the bottom two figures. And the red profiles are at an earlier time than the blue profiles. That's showing you how the crater is evolving. But what you can see is that at early times, the depth is driven primarily in the depth direction. And at later times, it's driven in all three dimensions. So if we proceed to the next slide. Yes. That observation is really what's driving this scaling transition. So, and that aligns well with the fact that the pressure is the dominant parameter at play here. So at early times, you have the impinging pressure applying on a flat surface, and the depth is primarily in the depth direction, which is why the depth scales linearly with time. And then at a later times, after an appreciable crater shape is formed, the pressure is applied across the whole basin. And so that produces volumetric growth equally in all three dimensions. And so that's why depth growth itself is now has a 1/3 scaling. But the key takeaway from this observation is that F and G are not two independent parameters, but actually there's a 1/3 scaling relationship between these two erosion rate parameters. So what that means is that this whole crater growth process from initial times to later times can all be described in terms of one erosion rate parameter, F. Next slide, please. So there's a couple other critical things or aspects of the model that we can take away. One is the time of the transition, and two is the depth of the transition. So if we look at the left plot, the time seems to vary test to test, but the depth seems to be approximately constant. And so what we found is that the transition time between tests almost shows a perfect inverse relationship with this erosion rate parameter F. And so what that indicates, if all the data fell perfectly onto one line and it was one inverse relationship, what that would mean is that the critical depth where this transition occurs is constant throughout all cases, which is remarkable considering all the things that were varied test to test, but the critical depth should be the same. What instead we see is that there's actually two curves. One is the solid curve for supersonic cases and this dotted curve for subsonic cases. So there seems to be some sensitivity to the jet flow velocity. And in the next slide, we can see that, yes, and we can see that there is a slight relationship with that critical depth with the Mach number of the impinging jet. So next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'll just post my conclusions here, but I just want to thank NASA once again for the opportunity to collaborate on this project, and be happy to discuss further with anybody that's interested. Thank you.